Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a lecture on Max Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason, Chapter 4, which deals with the rise and decline of the individual. And so I'm going to be speaking specifically about individuality here and looking at what Horkheimer has to say about its loss today. When we think about individuality and the individual, we want to think first off of time and space and sense experience. We all exist in a particular time. We all exist in a particular space. We have different sensory experiences. But we mean more than that when we're talking about individuality. So Horkheimer says on page 91 that awareness of individuality as a conscious being, including recognition of his or her own identity. So who am I as a person? How do I identify myself? And of course, Horkheimer is writing in 47, and we talk about identity in many more diverse ways today than he did then. But the question that he would ask us is, when we talk about our identity, are we talking about ourselves as conscious beings, recognizing who we are in our own individuality? Well, what does it mean to talk about our own individuality? Horkheimer wants to trace individuality back to the Greeks. We've seen this in chapter 3, where he talks about the domination of nature, how he traces that idea of the modern individual back to Odysseus. Here he wants to follow the idea of individuality itself all the way back to ancient Greece, and he begins by talking about Pericles' funeral oration. And here you know Pericles as a famous Athenian, and there's this oration over the Athenians who lost their lives defending Greece, and he says, "Future ages will wonder at us as the present age wonders at us now." And what we see here, according to Horkheimer, is a sacrifice of immediate satisfaction for security, both material and spiritual. So there's a distinction between our immediate desires and what we might call were long-term desires. And this involves not simply the sacrifice, but the combination which Horkheimer finds in ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, the combination of self-preservation and reflection. So it's not just self-preservation, which we see Horkheimer criticize throughout the first 3 chapters of Eclipse of Reason, but self-preservation in conjunction with reflection. And so if you think about chapter 1 and chapter 2, the two competing panaceas, we might say that science deals primarily with self-preservation and Neo-Thomism deals primarily with reflection. And what Horkheimer is trying to say is that we need both of those. Or to be more specific, we might talk about subjective rationality and self-preservation, objective reason and reflection. And so we're getting to a point in this text where Horkheimer is saying, look, we've got these two problems. Right now, the subjective rationality is being dominant. What we need is a combination, and that's where individuality arises. Now, there's a sense in Greece where this individuality means that I can dominate others without losing my own freedom, and that was a question, of course, in our interpretation of Odysseus. If you're interested in how we interpreted Odysseus, I encourage you to go back and look at my lecture on chapter 3. But here we're going to move on with a discussion of Greek individuality and how that leads into individuality today. And so what we see here in Greece in this first sort of step towards individuality is there's a balance between the individual and society. And Horkheimer says on page 96 that the fully developed individual is the consummation of a fully developed society. So if society is developed fully, then and only then can we have a fully developed individual. Now, you might be aware of, for example, Catholic social thought. This is similar to Pope Pius VI talking about integral human development, where he says we have to focus not simply on the economic, but we have to focus on the whole person. Many Catholic traditions emphasize this. So we see this in the Dominican tradition. We also see this in the Jesuit tradition, that there's a focus on the whole individual. And that's what Horkheimer is looking at here in terms of this balance between the individual and society. Horkheimer goes on to say that Socrates is really this true herald of abstract individuality. So that what we see in Socrates is this attempt to develop the individual conscience in relationship as a sort of, as Socrates himself would say, as a gadfly to society. So on page 95, Horkheimer says that Socrates explicitly defends the autonomy of the individual. The universal now is conceived as an inner, almost self-authenticating truth. So truth is not simply what society tells me. So you'll see again here that Horkheimer is pushing against the idea of conformity. And if we see anyone in the history of Western philosophy who does that, it certainly is Socrates in the philosophical tradition. We might talk about Jesus within the religious tradition, but pushing against conformity with society and resisting that and trying to reach this balance. But this has a point that we'll come back to later, that insofar as the individual withdraws from society, which we see to a great extent in the modern world, but particularly in the United States, insofar as the individual withdraws from participating in the political affairs of society, then society tends to revert to the law of the jungle. And in this situation, any sense of individuality is crushed. And here again, we see that what Horkheimer is looking for is a balance. He's not saying society dominates. He's not saying that the individual dominates. He's saying there's a balance here. Without that balance, then individuality simply can't exist, and we're in this sort of law of the jungle. Of course, Christianity helps to develop the idea of individuality. And so Horkheimer says that in Christianity, what we see is that the person denying himself or herself in order to guarantee the eternal life develops a depth that was lacking in ancient Greece. So here again, we have this denial of immediate desires for something more long-term. In ancient Greece, it was the long-term of history, the long-term of honor. In Christianity, it's eternal. It's this eternal life with God. And so there's a depth here that is missing in ancient Greece. So Horkheimer says on page 98, by the very negation of the will to self-preservation on earth in favor of the preservation of the eternal soul, Christianity asserted the infinite value of each person. Now there's something very important there, right? That Jesus' death on the cross for each of us is saying that each of us is infinitely valuable, right? Because Jesus, as the Son of God, is infinitely valuable. He sacrifices himself for us. Well, Horkheimer doesn't stop there, right? He says the price for this was the repression of vital instincts. And that didn't happen right away, of course, in Christianity. It developed over a long time and sort of reached its zenith in the Middle Ages with the Inquisition, right? And so there's a repression of vital instincts, of the desire for life, of self-preservation here on earth for this sort of eternal salvation. You can think about this. We've talked about Neo-Thomism, and that certainly seems to be true for many characteristics of Neo-Thomism. But within Thomas himself, if you read Thomas's Aquinas' philosophy, he says that there is in fact a balance between earthly happiness and heavenly happiness, and that we cannot achieve that heavenly happiness without engaging in the political here and now, without engaging in what our own value is here and now. Of course, Christianity is not the end. We then move into liberalism. We've already talked about how objective reason had to fail, and what had to take its place was subjective rationality. But that leads to this liberalism. And we're talking here about the broad term liberalism. We're not talking about Democrats in the United States. We're talking about the idea that both unites conservatives in the GOP and liberals in the Democratic Party. I'm talking here, of course, about the United States. We could talk about conservatives and the left in the UK or on the continent in Europe. But it's this idea of freedom of the individual and freedom of the market. And under this liberalism, Horkheimer says that individuality was completely subordinated to self-preserving reason. It became a synthesis of our own material interest. And so what we see today is lots of people try to express themselves, to express their individuality through purchasing things, right? And we all go to the same stores, whether it's Target or whether it's Macy's, right? We're looking for something that identifies us as who we are. And in fact, what we're doing is we're just participating in the same market that makes us all consumers. So we lose this individuality to self-preserving reason, and what we end up with is just the domination of material interest. And so today we're left with sort of a zombie life. I encourage you to go and watch the movie Shaun of the Dead, which really encapsulates the idea that life today in consumer society is a life of the zombie. And you can find clips on YouTube that point to this. But the idea here is this, that individuality, again, is impaired when each individual divorces himself or herself from society and tries to live on their own. Now what we get is the law of the jungle. Of course, what helps in that is that universal values, which once supported individuality, are now turned into marketing schemes, right? The absolute is reduced to something that is just for the immediate concerns, for self-preservation. And I encourage you, of course, to read what Horkheimer has to say about these things. But particularly on page 101, the idea of eternal bliss and everything relating to the absolute have been reduced to the function of religious edification, conceived as a leisure time activity, right? Going to church is about leisure. It happens on Sunday when we're off work. The idea of happiness has similarly been reduced to a banality to coincide with leading the kind of normal life that serious religious thought has often criticized. And we see this in terms of Pope Francis, right? Criticizing this material lifestyle that we have. The very idea of truth has been reduced to the purpose of a useful tool in the control of nature, and the realization of the infinite potentialities inherent in man has been relegated to the status of a luxury. What do we need to do? We need to survive. We need to get that job. We need to get that house. We need to get the family, and maybe at some point when we retire, we can sort of relax in our luxuries. Of course, that's the whole opposite of what we mean by happiness, and the whole idea of individuality itself. And so Horkheimer says, quite interestingly, of course, that this idea of production has become the idol today. It's the golden calf that we worship, right? And what we actually see, of course, is that when we look at productivity, productivity has increased tremendously, but real wages have decreased or stayed stagnant. And this is true even today after the financial crisis of the 2007-2008, which we look at here. And of course, what we saw here was that these banks were too big to fail. And so they added nothing to productivity, and yet we spent our money, our tax dollars, supporting the banks rather than paying for those who have increased productivity. And so productivity becomes a religious creed, a means in the struggle for power. Here we have a scene from a still from the movie Serenity. And what we see in the movie Serenity is this struggle over individuality and power. And we see on the right side here, the Alliance coming to, I'm sorry, that's on the left side. The Alliance waiting for the ship Serenity to come in, and they're going to blast Serenity out of the sky because Serenity wants to question the Alliance. So Horkheimer says that the task today for us, the task of the masses today consists not in clinging to traditional party patterns, but rather in recognizing and resisting the monopolistic pattern that is infiltrating our organizations and infesting our minds individually, right? So we go to resisting the idols that we have put up. We go to resisting the idea of Christmas as consumerism. We go to resisting the idea that hope rests in one person. We go into resisting the idea that the Army or the Navy or America's military strength is where our happiness lies, and we find it in something else, right? So finally, Horkheimer ends this chapter with this wonderful quote, which I'll leave you with, and thank you for watching.